we'll start with some greetings first from our Dean, Professor Gila Stopler.
Thank you very much, Shelly, and thank you everybody who has joined us. So I want to welcome you all to what is actually our 17th International Human Rights Researchers Workshop on the subject of crowdsourcing and the decline of the individual. This event actually fits perfectly with our law school's credo because the legal education that we aspire to provide to our students rests on 4 pillars: professionalism, interdisciplinarity, globality, and values. And for this reason, we offer our students 4 specialization tracks that include specializations in commercial law, in high-tech and venture capital law, in criminal law, and in human rights law. We also offer them a range of courses in English, exchange programs, and international competitions. We also at the College of Law and Business believe that one of our central missions as academics is to improve society and to help protect the rights of all people living in it. At the same time, we strive to give our students the best practical legal training possible. And we combine these 2 objectives through the human rights clinic we offer our students, which include a range of human rights subjects, including social and political rights, criminal justice, corporate social responsibility. Throughout the years, our clinics have had some outstanding achievements out of around 20 cases in which the Israeli Supreme Court has struck down laws for violating the basic laws on human rights. The college was the petitioner or the co-petitioner in 5 cases, including our groundbreaking international precedent in which the Israeli Supreme Court has struck down the privatization of prisons in Israel. As part of our emphasis on developing the theory of human rights, the president of the college, Professor Moshe Cohen-Elia, has launched 16 years ago our international journal, The Law and Ethics of Human Rights. This peer-reviewed symposium-based journal, under whose auspices this workshop takes place, serves as a platform for the publication of articles that originate from these international workshops, which we hold at the college annually. During these workshops, leading academics from around the world, such as yourselves, present papers on cutting-edge legal and ethical issues, which we carefully choose each year. Example of past issues include private power and human rights and the rights of non-humans, the sharing economy, markets and human rights, democratic backsliding, mixed constitutions and human rights, and more. Due to our careful selection of topics, participants, and articles, since launching the Law and Ethics of Human Rights, it has gained an impressive international reputation. And in 2020, it was ranked 3rd in the world in the category of human rights, and also 3rd in the category of law and ethics among all law journals by the American Washington and Lee Law Review ranking. Now, we believe the topic that was chosen for this year's workshop, crowdsourcing and the decline of the individual, is such a cutting-edge topic, and that the Law and Ethics of Human Rights volume on this topic, in which your articles will appear, will provide an important contribution to the discussions in this area. Now, our top students serve as student editors on the journal's student editorial board, get an inside look into the processes of academic research and writing on the highest levels. And you will see them present here among us throughout the workshop. Unfortunately, as we all know, due to the pandemic, we are compelled to hold the event online this year, as we had to last year. We're very sorry for that. We hope to be able to create the same intellectually stimulating environment that we managed to create in the physical workshops every year, despite the less than ideal conditions. And we apologize in advance for the significant time differences between participants, the constraints of Zoom fatigue, which we're all now very familiar with. So I want to thank Professor Shelly Kreiczer-Levy and Dr. Iddo for coming up with the topic of this workshop, for their brilliant organization of it. I also want to thank all the administrative personnel who have helped in the organization and who are still helping to ensure that everything runs smoothly. I want to give special thanks to all of you, our participants, for accepting our invitation, for joining us in what is sure to be an exciting and thought-provoking workshop. And I hope that we'll have a chance to meet you all here soon in Tel Aviv in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gila. And so good afternoon, morning or night, and thank you all for joining us from various time zones. We are very excited about this conference. When Tamara and I started planning the conference, we were interested in the power and vulnerabilities of crowds in digital spaces and in the rights of individuals and groups within crowds. And reading through the papers, there are several questions or themes that come up, and I think that we're going to unpack throughout the following 3 days. So the first question is, what is a crowd? And the formal definition of crowdsourcing includes a large, diverse, unorganized group of individuals, but perhaps the notion of crowds can also be extended to a group that shares a common agenda, such as grassroots organizations. A second question is what the crowd can achieve, or what sort of purposes and goals the crowd can promote, and the task that the crowd can perform. And this inquiry takes a more positive perspective to crowds, and it examines its potential power to enforce norms, to gather information, to influence or direct public policy. Now, a different perspective asks about the vulnerabilities of crowds and looks for the source of power that drives crowds and capitalizes on the crowd's work. And power can be held by private actors, and it can be held by public actors. And this leads me to a fourth question: who manages the crowds, and what is the right governance for crowds? And all these questions have an underlying theme or query, which is the role of individual and individual rights within crowds. And so we're looking forward to unpacking these questions with you. And now to some logistics. So first, the conference is being recorded, so please note. Second, we have a slot today for an informal gathering at 8:45 p.m. Tel Aviv time, and we're using the Wonder app to get to know one another. So it is basically a virtual space where we have a space set for the conference, and people can virtually walk around and form or join groups and discuss. And so we created areas within the space with questions or icebreakers to get the conversation going and get to know one another. And so the questions are, if you'd like to prepare, if you hadn't already, my academic cliche, my technological addiction, show and tell, share a story about an item that relates to you or your research, if I weren't an academic, and an item that you always carried. And so Tamara and I look forward to the discussions, and we want to thank the administrative staff, the presenters, commentators, chairs, as well as all of you for joining us. And let's begin with the first panel.
Okay, so
Gila, you're muted.
You're muted.
yeah, I noticed. So I have been given the task to chair the first panel, and I'm very happy to do so. Just to continue the logistics, so we want to have, because due to Zoom fatigue and all the problems we are already familiar with in the Zoom, we need to devise a system in which people can stand within or talk within the timeframes that are allotted to them. I'm going to try to use these type of of notes. Hopefully, it will be noticeable And if not, then I'm afraid that I'm going to have to be a little more rude and just, at a certain point, interrupt people and tell them that they still have 5 minutes or 1 minute or 0 minutes. If anybody has a better idea on how to do that, then please let me know, because I don't think that, I at least haven't heard of a better idea yet. So our first panel is on crowdsourcing and the wisdom of the crowd. And we'll have two very interesting papers. I'll present the first, and then we'll have the discussion, and then I'll present the second. So our first paper is by Berti Suman from the European Commission and Amelia Burnette from the University of Strathclyde. And it's entitled Resisting the Decline of the Individual by Crowdsourcing Environmental Information. The commentator for this paper is Charles Martin Shields from the German Development Institute. And the way this is going to work, as it always does in our conferences, is we'll have the commentator start with a 15 minutes presentation and comment on the paper, and then 10-minute response by the authors. And then we'll have an open discussion for 20 minutes. So I would like to start with the commentator. Is Charles Martin here? Shelly, do you know?
I'm just checking to see if he's here.
We can switch the order of the papers if that will make it easier.
Okay, let me just see. Yeah, I don't see him. I don't see him here. So I'll write him an email, and maybe we should maybe we'll switch the panels. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm switching the order of the paper. So we'll start with the paper by Boaz Miller. Boaz, I hope it's okay with you, from the Zefat Academic College. And his paper is entitled Integration versus Aggregation as Methods of Sourcing, Why Not Both? And Iddo Porat from our own College of Law and Business will comment on the paper. So Iddo, you have 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think you should have asked me if it's okay to switch.
Yeah, I know, but
of the work. So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers, Shelly and Tamar, for a wonderful event, very topical one, wonderful collection of people, and I really look forward to discussions, and thanking them for inviting me to comment. I will comment on Boaz Miller paper titled Integration versus Aggregation as Methods of Sourcing, Why Not Both? The paper is in stage of extended abstract, and I'll comment on it as such, of course, and take it also as an opportunity to verge in some interesting or what I find to be interesting ways of thinking about these very questions. The paper presents a very wonderful way of looking at both these methods, integration and aggregations, as methods of group inquiry or group deliberation or decision-making, discussing their relative strength and weaknesses, and then ending up with what seems to me a very convincing and promising solution or suggestion, which is to combine them depending on the context with different stages, including in this combinations. My comments would be elaborating on some of the ways in which the final paper could be fleshed out, and thinking about some examples that we can further think about, especially from my own field, which is law generally and constitutional law in particular. So The paper starts with a kind of a background to group deliberation or group knowledge formation, which is from the philosophy of knowledge, or what is called epistemology, and with a debate within epistemology between classical epistemology and more modern or sociologically oriented epistemology, which takes groups or communities into account as well. And Miller tells us that according to classical epistemology, we know something. So I know, for example, that I'm looking at a computer or that there is a computer in front of me. If I believe that there is a computer in front of me, B, I have good reason to believe that there's a computer in front of me, sort of because I see it. And C, there is actually a computer in front of me. So the truth of the matter is that this is not just an illusion. Now, what is common to these is that this is an individualist perspective, and communities and groups don't really enter into these equations. And modern epistemology, or epistemology of science, later on develops other theories, in particular dependency thesis of epistemology, which says that all of these things also relate and in an intrinsic way, sort of inherent way, to the way I am situated within a community, to what community standards are, and what kind of epistemic knowledge and epistemic events might happen to the community prior to me making statements or acquiring knowledge. So this would be the later versions of epistemology. And from this, and there's some further elaborations by Miller on this topic, but from this, the paper moves on to discuss the way group knowledge and also group decision-making can be framed based on these two versions of integration and aggregation. So once kind of we got into the frame of mind of group thinking and how community shapes knowledge, we get into these two possibilities. And Miller does a great job in highlighting some of the advantages and disadvantages of both. So we start with integration. Integration would, the advantages of integrations are actually, we can see them in the word integration itself, which are that the different pieces of knowledge or expertise or background are integrated into something which is greater than the part through deliberation, through sharing of knowledge, so that the product is the end results of all these shared knowledges. So for example, the product would therefore show us or be based on the best of expertise of each of the people there. So because each of them can share the knowledge, and this kind of the best knowledge would be out there, and the outcome would be more than the sum of its parts. But integration also has its limitations. And in particular, it is more susceptible than aggregation to bias. And that is because people tend in deliberation and discussions to follow the majority, to be biased in other ways by who is the person who's speaking, to have information cascade so that they rely on other people and put back their own or don't regard their own initial inclinations. And therefore information relies one on the other, and we have information cascades, and we have a whole set of biases that cognitive psychology has been talking about for a long while. Aggregation, on the other hand, does not include sharing or the initial step of integrating or sharing the different perspectives, but collecting them in some way or the other, different ways of collecting. And here we get to crowdsourcing. So aggregation might be more typical of crowdsourcing, but actually it would be interesting to think whether crowdsourcing necessarily connotes aggregation rather than integration, or can include both. Aggregation, it's much better at predicting things or getting at results. It is better anyway than the individual members. This is the great insight of crowdsourcing. But it is good for certain things rather than other things. It is good when we have a kind of a concrete question or a number question. It is good for, but it is not so good for other things, such as being creative, finding solutions outside of the box. And in particular, it is very dependent on how we set the question that we aggregate answers about. This could be manipulated. So the end results is the kind of suggestion that we might start with deliberation or integration of a varied and diverse group. And this will be followed by some time taken for each member of the group to deliberate by herself or in her group, and then with aggregation as the end results of the process. So we can combine the advantages of both, and that would be one way of not having to choose between two. Okay, so this is a very quick, by the limitation of the time, highlighting of some of the aspects of the paper. And as I said, the idea of combining the two things, I think, is very appealing, the two ways, two methods. And also the stress of contextualizing, I think, is important, and thinking very well, and I think we'll do that probably, and we can see that in different papers, what kind of method applies to which context, to what purpose, and how we can best make use of different tactics or methods to get at group decision-making, group deliberations, and so on. So generally, this is a great project. I'll have 4 points to talk about. I'll start with the relationship between the first part and the second part of the paper. So I think it's a great idea to start with epistemology and look at the insights of epistemology, specifically epistemology of science, as a way of getting insight into group thinking in other contexts and crowdsourcing. But in the final paper, I would suggest also thinking about how they might be distinct, or how much we can, or in what areas we can make good use of this, and what areas are different. And this shifts me to the second point, which is about the different examples and purposes, and Shelly talked about this as well, of group thinking that are all in the paper. But again, in the final paper, I suggest differentiating between them more in order to tailor what we want to say about each, and tailor also the juxtaposition of integration and aggregation regarding them. And in particular, we can make a first cut between group thinking about knowledge, or about truth, or about fact, or about science, which relates to the first part of the paper, and then group thinking that ends up with decision making, and in particular decision making with a normative aspect, such as ending up with a policy or law, or a way of distributing goods, something that affects a group. So when we move from the facts or science to the normative aspect, then we have the double meaning, or the two aspects that are assigned to how we choose how to deliberate or participate, which is, and this is in the paper as well, I'm just highlighting it, and this is in, I think, most of the paper as well. I will call the first the instrumental aspect of deliberation and participation and crowdsourcing. So how much it will be helpful for the end result, and the intrinsic. So whenever we have a normative aspect, intrinsic aspect comes usually from the fact that we assign equal worth and autonomy to each person, so that decisions affecting the person has a right to participate in them and to affect their own fate. And when we get to this intrinsic aspect of deliberation, then some persons might have more or should have more of a say more than others. And here, if I move on to my field of constitutional law, there's a theory about why judicial review is important. And the theory is it's not only instrumental, but intrinsic in the sense that we are owed an explanation in our day in court for when we are harmed or when a certain policy affects us. So we should have standing and should be able, and there should be deliberation and a consultation with us prior or as a way of explaining why things are done to us. So this is one way of intrinsic value. And basically democracy is based also on instrumental aspects and intrinsic aspects of equal worth. And we should add also the issue of minorities, what we do with minorities in decision making, and whether we have the veto power of a minority, and whether how we take minority accounts into account. And rights basically are also one of veto power of rights, of individual rights are also an aspect of that. So this is the second part about the intrinsic and the instrumental value of deliberation.
Sorry, though, you're not looking at the camera, so you have 3 minutes. Okay?
Yeah, I am looking at my watch though, but thank you. The third point is yet again bringing up another way in which we can apply group and integration versus aggregation, and that is adjudication. Okay, so here we can draw on some very interesting examples, and the debate could basically be about whether deliberation prior to voting is good or bad. So we can think of juries, right, where they deliberate and then end up voting. And we can think of some judicial panels, such as the American Supreme Court, where basically they vote and then sometimes they deliberate or also give reasons for their voting. So deliberation, good or bad. And I would add that this question is not, should not be separated also from another question, which is what kind of majority we want to have in the voting. So the kind of majority, for example, in juries, if we have unanimity, then this definitely affects the deliberation, definitely affects the minority voice. If you've seen 12 Angry Men, what you can do with a minority voice in jury deliberation. And constitutions are actually based on similar principles. We require usually a greater majority to enhance deliberation, to enhance participation, both for instrumental reason, better product, and for non-instrumental reasons. And finally, final point is a kind of a general point, not necessarily related to this particular paper, and that is that when we are talking about kind of this group thinking and group intellect, or the wiseness of the group, we can think, and especially in the law, not only in terms of synchronically, but diachronically, so in terms of time. And we can think of Edmund Burke here and the wisdom of the ages, and the English casuistry is based on kind of a crowdsourcing of the ages, right? About versus the singular thinking of the civil law lawyer who thinks in the abstract. So drawing on this kind of analogy, when we think about the stock of a single man's wisdom versus the stock of the ages, this is kind of group thinking or group intellect or crowdsourcing that we can think of also in legal terms and in terms of legal tradition, but also over time. So I'll end in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iddo. Thank you so much for being exactly on time and for your very interesting comment. Boaz, you have 10 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to be brief. First, I thank Iddo for the very charitable presentation of a very premature paper. It's not like the best, it's not ripe yet. put it this way. So I'll try to first to explain the project more, and then I'll respond to Iddo's comments. So the idea of the project is in line with this conference, with this workshop, is how to extract knowledge from a group. So we know that groups possess knowledge, and the question is how best to outsource this knowledge or extract it. And there is in the literature that exists, there is a battle of giants. On the one hand, we have Cass Sunstein, a legal scholar, who argues that the best way to extract knowledge from a group is by methods such as voting. And we have also James Sorowitsky with the theory of the wisdom of crowds, who also say that people need to decide independently, make a judgment independently, and then we need to aggregate their judgments into one decision. That's the best way. This is in this way we avoid all kind of biases, etc. On the other hand, on the other side, we have Jürgen Habermas, who advocates deliberation and exchange of ideas, and also Helen Longino from Stanford, a very well-known philosopher, who also argues for the benefits of group discussion and deliberation. And my basic claim is, why not both? Or why not pick the method that is best appropriate for a given task or for a given question? And why not both? Why not use both of them together in a particular situation in different stages of the process? That's basically the suggestion. But in order to make this suggestion, I need to do a lot of conceptual work, because there is a mess in the literature. The people are talking past each other. One thing is that people talk about knowledge, but they don't adhere to one definition of knowledge, particularly not the definition that is common in the study of knowledge, in the discipline that studies knowledge, epistemology, social epistemology in particular. So basically, and there are all kinds of empirical results that show different and allegedly conflicting results, because they just test different things, but use a common language. So there is a lot of mess in the literature. And basically my project is trying to study this mess, to organize the discussion around common terms, and try to identify the method that is best appropriate for each task. That's the project. So let's see. So the relation between the two parts of the article, of the paper, that's Iddo's first point. Well, I'm an epistemologist and a philosopher of science, and I'm interested primarily in knowledge, in epistemic properties of the group. I'm less interested in legitimate, politically legitimate decisions. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in that only to the extent that they are needed in order to generate knowledge. And they are needed. Knowledge needs to be politically legitimate, but I'm not interested in political legitimation as such, only as it is instrumental to, let's say, to getting at the truth, roughly speaking. And one of the problems in the mess that I described before is that people don't make that distinction well enough between political legitimation and epistemic justification or legitimation or legitimacy. They just use them together. Habermas certainly does so. He thinks that no, he just conflates all the time between what decisions are politically legitimate versus what are actually good or true in some objective sense. And also Sunstein, because he's a legal scholar, and legal scholars also have a tendency, I know that I might offend some people here, to hijack the discussion to what they care about. So this is exactly the move that I want to avoid. I want to discuss political legitimacy or legitimation only in as much as it facilitates epistemic justification or knowledge. And I think this is a project that is worthy on its own. And you might say, I'm not, there are issues that are hard to determine an objective truth about, all kinds of value questions and normative decisions. So maybe the discussion is not relevant to those. Having said that, issues such as giving minority more representation, or making sure that the group is diverse, or all kinds of things, or all kinds of practices that are important for political legitimacy are also important for epistemic justification. You need diversity as well. You need to give a voice to the minority. So there are parallels, but still I want to maintain the discussion separate. With respect to adjudication, I think that adjudication is just another form of deliberation between judges. And as Iddo pointed out, it's true, we can have adjudication at different levels. Still, I want to stress the difference between making a decision that can stick politically, something that can enjoy public trust because it was performed by a certain political process that is agreed upon by the public or has some, I don't know, historical roots, and the question of getting at the right decision, which are two different things. And last, regarding the dimension of time, that's a very neat proposal. Thank you. I need to think about it, how to integrate like the wisdom of the ages into the wisdom of crowds. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Boaz. And you didn't take up all of your time, so we have a few more minutes for discussion. I suggest that whoever wants to comment and wants to has a question will either raise their hand or maybe write in the chat, and then we'll just take people by turn. Alexandra, did I see you raise your hand? No?
No, but I'm happy to ask a question if nobody else has one
okay,
yet.
sure, no, because I think I saw your hand. So you get the, please ask a question.
Yeah, so my question is for the author, for Boaz, and it's around the curious idea of truth. The idea that you can get to truth in the context of crowdsourcing, and so I'm curious as to what that means. And of course, I'm coming from the perspective of public participation and engagement, where the idea of that there's a truth is, I think, it's difficult to wrap one's head around. So I'd love to hear more about what truth might look like in his conception.
Okay, can I answer now? Oh,
yeah, sure.
Okay, so in the paper, I give an example that was given by Sorowitzky, and it was originally described by Francis Galton, a British scientist, the father of eugenics, unfortunately. And he describes a contest where there was a bull, like a cow, a bull, and people had to guess its weight. And the person who got closest to its actual weight won the bull, right? That was the contest. And what Galton did, he bought all of the tickets that people wrote their guesses on and calculated the average. And it turns out that the average was closer to the actual weight of the bull than any of the guesses, or most of the guesses of the people, including expert butchers that were there, and it was their profession to estimate the weight of an animal. So in this case, like surely there is some truth there is some truth. There is an actual weight of the bull, right? You can weigh it, and maybe several times if you need to. At some level of accuracy, you can say, okay, this is the weight of the bull. And you can say, well, this guess is closer to the truth or further away from the truth, and so on. So there are, I think, at least some issues that there are a simple empirical there is a fact of the matter whether a certain answer is true or false, and there is an empirical way to determine that. Now, I know that people are skeptical of truth, but on the other hand, the same people that are now very skeptical of truth are also the one that warn about global climate change, and they advocate the safety of vaccines, and so on. And these are, factual questions. Whether the world is warming up or not, whether it is warming up due to human activity, to the emission of fossil fuels, and so on. This is a factual question. And when we want to harness the public, or we want the public to change its behavior in order to prevent climate catastrophe, we want to do it in a way that will actually persuade the public. That's true. But there is also a fact of the matter, whether the world is heating up or not, and whether we are the cause of it. And the best way to know that factual truth is to turn to science. And if you turn to scientists, you see that what they do is deliberate. Like they use the method of integration that I discussed. Maybe they can use other ways. Maybe they can also incorporate some forms of aggregation. But currently, it's a consensus statement. It's a form of deliberation that the IPCC presents. So I think, in short, there are issues, especially now. I think that everybody can see that there are issues that truth, in a strong sense, with a capital T, plays an important role, not just perception of truth or public or just political legitimation. And this is the truth that I want to get at.
Thank you, Boaz. Alon?
Hi, Boaz, a fascinating paper. I have two unrelated questions. The first one is regarding the question of, do we have an account for the mechanism that makes it think that aggregation is produce knowledge? So it reminds a bit of Getier's fourth condition, and the question of how do we know in which case would the people that guess the bull's weight will be, the average will be right? Under what conditions would they be correct, and under what conditions they would not be correct, and would produce worse outcomes than some forms of integration? So that's one question. The second relates to the reactionary. So I'm quarantined with my daughter. So so apologies. I need to go, and I'll return with another question if it will be possible. Sorry.
Okay, so thank you. So with respect to how do we know that the guess is right and not just fluke, or you mentioned the Gettier cases. So yeah, we need, conceptually speaking, we need to incorporate into our conception of knowledge some anti-luck conditions. So we want it to be not just a lucky guess. And the way to do it is just to make sure that the guess or the method works consistently over time. So if it just, the more time it gets more or less accurate results, the more we are convinced that it wasn't just a fluke or a matter of brute luck, and that the method actually works. Of course, every method is fallible, right? We may still be wrong. So at the conceptual level, you have to add some anti-luck condition, and at the practical or methodological level, you have to add some consistency requirement. Test the whatever method you're using on different occasions, on different problems, to see that it actually works in many cases, not just in one.
Thank you, Boaz. Shelly?
Thank you, Boaz. That was really fascinating. And I want to ask a little bit more about the line between knowledge and legitimacy, and I hope that I won't be one of
Sorry,
those.
I didn't hear the language of?
The line between
Okay.
knowledge and legitimacy, and I hope I won't be one of those lawyers that pester you with their legitimacy questions. So you talk about knowledge, but knowledge is always used and applied, right? So questions that may come up is who controls the knowledge and who benefits from knowledge. So in the context of crowdsourcing, many times it's huge platforms. So does that make a difference about the way that the knowledge is created and then curated and then applied? Does it affect the knowledge? And also, what about legitimate ways of actually using knowledge once we have knowledge?
Okay, thanks. Good question. So I'm not, to be clear, I'm not saying that political legitimacy and knowledge have nothing to do with each other. On the contrary, right? In epistemology, I'm considered pretty radical in the view that they are closely connected. But when I face lawyers or legal scholars, I have to push back against the idea that there is no truth and there is just political legitimacy. So I've made my view more extreme than it actually is. So basically, right, my view at least, some other people also think so. When we announce a certain view as knowledge or as known, there is a chance of error, and there are two kinds of errors: false positives and false negatives. We might deem something as true when it is false, or we might deem something as false when it is true. And every kind of error has its costs. Some people, as you pointed out, will suffer from that error. Right? If I determine that a certain substance is safe for consumption, but it's not, it's actually carcinogenic, then the people who consume it will be harmed. On the other hand, if I determine that it's unsafe, then the industry, which can use perhaps the more cheaper substance than a more expensive substance, will be harmed. Also, the public will have to pay more for a certain product. So there's also always this weighing of inductive risks. These risks are called inductive risks, and you weigh them against each other. And my own view is that for a claim to be epistemically legitimate, to count as knowledge, it has to rely on a politically legitimate weighing of inductive risks against each other. So you need some kind of agreement, that politically legitimate agreement that says that these are the risks that we are willing to tolerate, these are the risks that we are not willing to tolerate, these are the population that we as a public or as a society are more willing to be susceptible to certain damages or harms, and these are the harms that we want more to prevent. And once you set this weighing of risks, and you can say that the certain view meets the standards that legitimate a certain view, meet those weighing, then it is both epistemically and politically legitimate. That's my own view. Other people think like me, but some people think that that's just wrong. There is no connection whatsoever between knowledge and political legitimacy. But I actually think that there is.
Thank you, Boaz. Tamam?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper, and I want to try to push back even more about following up on Sandor's question, and ask you again about the relationship between policymaking and truth. Now, I'm not saying that there is no truth. I'm not denying the concept of truth, but I do think there's a difference between price estimation or price determination and policymaking, in the sense that price is actually set by the crowd, right, in a way. And there's a final price at which a particular bull is then sold, which is the objective truth value that we can use as a benchmark to assess the truth. But I'm not sure that that's exactly the same as deciding on a policy, on whether we'd like to force a closure or would like to allow the government to spy on us in order to prevent the spread of a pandemic, right? Is there even a truth to be gotten here, or is this really more a matter of opinion on what would be the best? I mean, I think this is what Iddo was also getting at sort of normative policy questions, where it's a question on how, what exactly we're doing here when we're extracting crowd, not crowd thinking, group thinking.
Okay, thanks. First, I just want to say that there is an entire literature about that, about those issues. If you like, I can give you a point of entry. Heather Douglas's book, Science, Policy, and the Value-Free Ideal. You know, look at it, look at the people that cite it, and you can know you'll fall into the rabbit hole. But I'll give I'll just say something trivial. I'm sorry, but it's trivial. But this is all I have to say. Sometimes we have to make policy decisions based on uncertain claims. We don't have knowledge. It's just unfortunate. We don't know enough, and we still have to make decisions. So we have to make the best decision that we can have on a basis that is far less than knowledge. And that's just how reality is. More than that, sometimes, you know, all of the facts are known, all of the evidence is available, and still there is no just one policy that one can make. You know, people in the COVID period, people have expected, had this view that if science gives you a certain, it gives you certain facts, even with a lot of certainty, then there is just one policy that is determined by those facts. And this is wrong. No, sometimes all of the evidence is clear and there is more than one possible and legitimate course of action. Depending on the different weighing of risks, depending on different public perceptions and so on. So yeah, we sometimes need to operate on much less than knowledge.
Anna?
Yes, so thank you. My small comment question, let's say, bridged what the commentator said, the word used, and the paper itself. My question is regards to the perspective through which you look at knowledge. So you mentioned, I think, or you or the commentator, extracting knowledge. So let's say I'm not super inclined to use this term, especially because extracting to me sounds a bit using knowledge for something, but looking at knowledge as produced by a group and used by somebody that is outside this group that is extracting this knowledge for their purpose. And I see, though, in your paper potential also to see knowledge as something produced inside the group and used by the group for leveraging their own aims and objectives. But I think the approach to how you extract or make use of this knowledge is quite different if you look at an external observer trying to find the best way to make use of, let's say, knowledge produced somewhere else or by somebody else, or rather the group itself that decide also the conditions under which this knowledge can be used, can be extracted, if you like. For example, how knowledge cooperatives are, data commons cooperatives, for example, are now like approaching this idea of using knowledge, but in a sort of a commonly agreed way by the same members of the group that produce this knowledge. So in short, like, do you see this use of knowledge by somebody within the group or outside the group or both, and how this change your lens?
Okay, thanks. Good question. So I'm not sure about the word extracting. Maybe it's not a good word. It certainly does not imply that once you extract it, it's no longer there, right? That's one meaning of extraction. So I'm not saying that once you extract the knowledge from the group ceases to have it, right? That's not the term that I'm using. And there is also a discussion, quite prolific discussion in social epistemology, of group knowledge that is explicit, right? Of knowledge that corporate agents have and declare it and use it and so on. But the case that I'm interested is different. The idea is that the metaphor of extraction comes to play because the idea is that there is group hidden, or knowledge that is hidden or is tacit within the group. It's in the individuals in some way, but you need some process to get it out because it's not apparent to anybody, even to the group member, that they have it as a collective, right? It's some form it's some process that transforms like the different pieces that individuals possess into something collective that was previously unrealized or unknown. So this is what the metaphor of extraction is trying to get at. And of course, this can be by an outside observer or some member of the group. This is another thing that the literature, the Sunstein literature, doesn't emphasize enough. Whose knowledge is it? And like who has the power to use it, as you mentioned. But my point is that the idea is that there is something tacit and unrecognized within the group and needs to be fleshed out in some way. There needs to be some process that fleshes it out, and this is what the metaphor of extraction is trying to get at. Maybe I need a different word. Maybe extraction is not good.
Thank you very much, Boaz. So I think it was a great discussion. I think it improved our knowledge on what we expect from crowdsourcing, which is an important question for this conference. So on this note, I would like to move on to the second paper, and I will reintroduce it. So this is a paper by Berti Suman from the European Commission and Amelia Burnette from the University of Strathclyde. And its title is Resisting the Decline of the Individual by Crowdsourcing Environmental Information. And the commentator will be Charles Martin Shields from the German Development Institute. So Charles, you have 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, and apologies for my tardiness. I got a little bit hung up with a childcare pickup and then a delayed train, so I apologize again. I really enjoyed reading this paper, not the least of which because I'm actually from North Carolina. So as I was reading this and reading about the firm that the authors wrote about, Duke Energy, a number of things and memories came to mind about the state and the fact that Duke Energy as a power company and as a utility is everywhere. I remember bicycling past their facilities on the way to school. So it was fascinating to read this and to learn in a way about my own home state in the United States, and to gain this perspective on citizen engagement and citizen crowdsourcing. Particularly in a setting where the state is, it's a well-developed state. I mean, we're talking about the United States, we're talking about a federal state within the American system. There are fully developed legal and regulatory structures. And yet, as I was reading this, and I remember this case coming up in newspaper articles, and this was something that was peripheral to my experiences in North Carolina. And I also have to admit, I'm completely unsurprised that it took citizen activism and it took crowdsourcing to push the North Carolina regulators, because there is very much an old boy system in North Carolina, and the relationship between Duke Energy and the government of North Carolina is a tight one, and at times an often problematic one. And I think this is a symbiosis between energy providers and state governments that is not unique to the state of North Carolina. So for me, this was just a really interesting article to read, just from a personal perspective of what I learned from it. But also it struck me as I was thinking about North Carolina and the wider Southeast United States, the role of civil society, especially in the South, in places where government doesn't always work for everybody. There is a long history in the Southern United States of this. It's a very acute problem. And because of that, the river keepers, but in other cases, in terms of voting rights, there are a number of areas where citizen engagement, the crowdsourcing of knowledge, of projecting citizens' voices, especially in opposition or contravention to the state, is very important. So this article touched on a number of kind of political sociologies that I've seen and really brought them together in a way that I found very fascinating. Something else as I was reading it, so by background, I'm a political scientist who works primarily on crowdsourcing, technology and innovation in humanitarian response and in global South contexts. My institute is a development institute. So a lot of my work is in Latin America, East Africa, Southeast Asia. And it was really fascinating to read this from the perspective of crowdsourcing and citizen science and citizen technology and citizen participation in a global North setting. Because a lot of what I see is kind of how do we use crowdsourcing? How do we use social innovation to address problems in sub-Saharan Africa is a lot of what I hear. And in reading this and in reading a case from a state like North Carolina, what really struck me was actually there are a lot of political and regulatory and legal apparatuses that are necessary to have in place for kind of citizen science and crowdsourcing to have an impact. So as I thought about this, I thought a lot of what I was seeing in this article worked, with the river keepers, for example, and I'll let the authors maybe dive a bit more into to who they are. But the river keepers, the communities who live near the affected rivers, using technology, basically using sensing and monitoring technology for water quality to be able to put together and collect information at the citizen level that could then be used to engage with the federal level legal apparatuses, the state level legal processes, to implement change, to implement citizen-centered change. And something that really struck me as I read this article in comparison to my experiences working on kind of innovation and technology in global South contexts was all the mechanisms of public administration were there. And you could see how highly organized citizen groups who could put together and crowdsource their data could then be the sum of their parts. They could kind of resist the atomization that can come with crowdsourcing and engage in the legal process and engage with regulatory systems in a way that put their needs front and center and also pushed back, I think, in my experience, the laziness of the regulatory apparatuses in the state of North Carolina and really pushed for an outcome that met their needs and kind of recognized their rights to, in this case, clean water. And it made me think, when I think about the work I've done in, say, East Africa, this worked so well for me, and it helped me kind of put some things together, because I thought a lot of times when I think about the work I do in East Africa, the tendency is to say, well, we use crowdsourcing and innovation to fill gaps that exist in jurisprudence, to fill gaps that exist in the apparatus of public administration. And I thought the lesson I really took away from this in terms of the case study was to say, well, what's the step before? What do we need in place legally for citizens to then be able to project the data and the information they crowdsource into a legal space, into a public policy space? Because without those apparatuses, without the legal structures, without the federal rules about clean water, if you don't have those, then kind of collective processes of crowdsourcing data among citizens. As I read this, I thought, well, it's not going to work. You need that in the background. And I thought that as I read this, this spoke not only to the case of North Carolina, potentially the case, as the authors point out, to say, how do you deal with this in a European context, civil versus common law difference. But this really speaks as well to, how do we think about these processes in the global South? How do we think about these processes in spaces where there are gaps in the administrative state? And what do we have to reflexively deal with in those kind of settings? The second thing is I was reading that I found really cool, and I found it really cool because a lot of times when I deal with technology and when I deal with policymakers talking about technology, it often kind of comes back to an iPhone and an app and the internet. And what I really enjoyed as I read this was, looking at sensing as a decentralized process. So, how do citizens use sensing tools and very basic sensing tools to look at things like water quality? And how do you use sensing technologies to align with what you hear and what you see and what you smell? How do you pull together these senses, and how do you use technology to reinforce what you're seeing as a person and as a member of a community, to kind of bring together a collection of data to project community influence against very powerful interests? So I was reminded Duke Energy is pretty inherent to everything in North Carolina. This is not a small entity that you're going up against. And it really made me think critically about, what do we talk about when we talk about crowdsourcing technology, and how do we break away from the kind of the app and platform centric tendency that policymakers have when they think about apps and innovation. I think about this in the German system. We talk about digitalization, which is fine. But what I really liked here was we said, well, how do we think of technology as an enhancement of our senses and a way to enhance our community's senses vis-a-vis the regulatory and administrative state to project and advocate for our rights. And that was really cool. The second thing it made me think about, just on that vein, was the way that technology doesn't have to be an artifact. And this is maybe a critique I might have, was to say, well, how did people bring all the data together? What were the platforming and storage structures they used? And I guess I could, that's one way to think of it. But the other way to think of it is that organization of data, the organization of information, is a technology itself, and it's an old one. The idea of public statistics and demographic statistics is a very old technology. It made me think of, if you go all the way back and look at what Foucault is talking about in 19th century cities in England, the idea of tracking medical data. So administrative statistics are a technology, and the gathering of information is a technological process, even if it's not an artifact-based process. And I think this article did a great job of kind of decoupling the idea of technology from the idea of it has to be an artifact, even if there were artifacts involved, the sensing tools that river keepers used. And then I kind of move forward to say, the crowdsourcing takes place within networks of local actors who have social capital. Again, a really positive thing that this article does is that it focuses on not only the administrative state and the legal processes involved, it does a very good job of saying, why did this work? And it wasn't that it wasn't just that there was data collected. It wasn't that there was just monitoring going on at the citizen level. It was that it was the right citizens doing this. So you had the river keepers, but you also had citizens who lived near water sources that were affected. And that it was these people who were involved in the data collection processes that really made a difference. And what's so cool about this is I think about my experience in other kind of tech and innovation settings, is that the tech kind of ends up being very central to the discussion, when what needs to be central to the discussion, and as this article points out, are the people involved. Because the people involved, being who they were, near water sources, or being river keepers, the role they played was what gave them access to the legal processes. And that gave kind of, in a way, power to the data that they had. a random person like me who doesn't live near these river sources could collect this data, but I don't have the standing to enter into the legal processes. And I think the article does a really good job of showing kind of the sociological processes and the sociological importance of who you engage with in crowdsourcing and data collection if you're trying to then to project power back toward the state and to assert your rights. One thing I would have liked to see, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, it would have been great to know more about kind of how is data stored, how is data aggregated. And maybe I didn't see it, and it didn't strike me as the front and center point in the paper, but just as a tech person, I would have been interested to say, well, were they storing these things in a GitHub repository? Were they storing the water data someplace like that? And how did that affect like the legal process? How did kind of the aggregation of data and the storage of data influence its legibility in the legal process? And what did the tech mean? Like, what did it mean for where and how they managed it in terms of a computing or a storage process? But that's, I think, a minor critique. So essentially I'd come away with, especially for the editors, and I can share my notes, you know, the things that it does quite well is to say, you know, you need these local systems. You need to be engaging the local systems of governance, and you need to be engaging with the right people in these local systems so that they have standing in a court of law, for example, in this case. And then the technology fits into that. It's not that technology creates the avenues, it's that the right people with the technology then can create the avenue to enforce change. And technology doesn't have to be an artifact. This was something I think is important, especially for those who do development economics and development research. So this article, I think, speaks to a lot of communities beyond just the legal community. Tech doesn't have to be an app. Tech can be behaviors. There are behavioral aspects of technology and data gathering. And in the end, I think too, just thinking about my experience, kind of what I learned as I read this article was to say, how do we evaluate the legal structures in place and who needs to be involved to be legible as a community to those legal structures and have access to them and have the right to be involved in them? And then how does technology fit into that space, into the liminal space between citizens and the state vis-a-vis an actor like an energy provider, like in this case, Duke Energy. So with that, I will leave it there. It was a really fascinating article, great sociology, really excellent legal examination. And I really enjoyed reading it. I thank the authors for giving me the chance to do so.
Thank you, Charles. So Anna and Amelia, you could maybe spend a few minutes just quickly describing your paper, because I'm not sure that everybody got the gist of the paper from the, from Charles's remarks, and then you'll have a few more minutes to respond to his remarks, if that's okay with you, if you want that.
Yes, of course. Very happy to hear these, let's say, very encouraging comments, and I'm sure this will spark a really nice discussion. Also because we seem to be from different backgrounds, both Amelia, myself, and the commentator, which I think it's really a big asset here. So the paper starts from basically an encounter between, let's say, myself, who I'm, let's say, focusing my last years of research with a research project called Sensing for Justice about citizen-gathered evidence as a source, indeed, of judicial evidence in environmental litigation and eventually mediation of environmental conflicts. So with this project, which is quite, let's say, case-oriented, so looking for let's say, inspiration in the world out there, I met Amelia, who has been working as a lawyer exactly on the Collage case. And I think from the encounter between, let's say, a project searching for further case studies and her expertise, we developed a study that basically challenges the same title of the conference, which is The Decline of the Individual, as we posit that through, let's say, crowdsourcing knowledge within the communities, or also this explained my question before, the people really can steer the sort of the destiny of an environmental matter that concern them. And by collecting data as not really as the outcome or the result, but really as a process, the community itself kind of take back agency and control on the environmental matter. And even if through challenges, difficulties with fatigue, over the time manages to, let's say, change something. So let's say our theory of change is that by civic monitoring, the people can really, let's say, get back in control of their land and demonstrate through monitoring a sort of care, a sense of care for their own environment. Also demonstrating this to regulators, to those agencies that kind of forgot the people and were making the interest of the company. In let's say, I'd like to then also go through the comments and start just responding a few of them, because it's also very rich in terms of discussion. But before, I just wanted to pass the word to Amelia, so she can also say a couple of words on how she got into this paper.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, so I'm Amelia Burnette. I'm currently a PhD researcher with the University of Strathclyde, but before that, practicing environmental law in the South in the United States for over a decade, and have experience with working with nonprofit groups like Riverkeepers and assisting them in taking information they have collected and using it in legal processes that are available. And one of those longer and more sustained efforts was in working to clean up coal ash contamination across the state of North Carolina at 14 power plants. Anna and I crossed paths and realized there was this sort of connection between, we were coming from very different perspectives, but working on citizen science from these different perspectives, and then pursued this case study. I also really appreciate the comments. I'm from Asheville, Charles. I don't know where you're from.
Chapel Hill.
Okay. So yes, you would have sort of up close and personal knowledge of the extent of the prevalence of this energy company and of coal-fired power plants, how much coal is burned in the southeastern United States. So I will respond to some of the comments, but Anna, why don't you go first?
Yes, of course. Maybe to start with, I can say that one of the aspects that really struck me and us over the, let's say, getting more and more into the case is that, exactly as the commentator said, we are not, let's say, often citizen science discussion and scientific analysis all revolve around data quality, robustness of the technology, which is definitely important and almost a precondition for any court action or any policy uptake of the results. But really the human drive to sense, to map their own environment, to take care of matter over time, and to really demonstrate this unique knowledge is an aspect that, in our view, can be the driver and also the game changer way more than the technology, because also the company, the government, have the technology and even better. And you mentioned South America, let's say the also global South, let's say from Africa to South America. And I can share that, let's say, a case that really brought me to civic monitoring was a case of Ecuadorian indigenous people that started building drones to map oil licenses and oil spills around the Amazon. And of course, their technologies were not better than those that the government had or the company had, but they really knew the land, knew the borders of their land. And so in a sense, I think the civic monitoring as care is something that we often forget, and I'm very happy that the article conveys this message. Second, of course, the idea of not only crowdsourcing data, but knowledge, which means expertise. So the fact that the people were the right citizens exactly suggests that often these people are probably the simplest locals, so fishers, farmers, but they managed to team up with also scientists and academics. And so in a sense, they built really a solid knowledge base. And through triangulation, so really melting together different angles, they build a knowledge base that often becomes also an asset for policymakers, for companies. And the point that you suggest on how all this data is infrastructured and organized is definitely something that will take as a suggestion to develop, because in fact, when it becomes an evidence base that eventually can be used, for example, as a database or evidence in litigation, then it's also very important how you create and also how you infrastructure this knowledge base. And lastly, my very last point is on the legal structures where this civic monitoring inserts. And a concept that with the Census project that I put also a link in the chat that we are also exploring is the idea of a right to contribute to environmental information. So not only produce or access information, but really having the right to be listened with the information you gather when this fills governmental gaps of reporting or companies reporting gaps. And we think that this kind of also legal infrastructuring is needed and should flank these very, let's say, remarkable examples, because these are still very context dependent. So in the Riverkeeper case, it was very successful, but context changing, this could be very unjust. So in another community, in another region, could not have the same luck. And this also, the Formosa case that we mentioned was a really outstanding case, but nowhere around the world a similar outstanding case happened so far, nor in the global south, neither in Europe. So in a sense, I think having also a legal recognition is particularly important to ensure, let's say, also an even playing ground. And in the European context, we are also exploring this side. It's definitely something for future research, because there's nothing like a recognition as such. There is not even a Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act like is there in the US, but the Aarhus Convention is there and is also opening its doors to civic monitoring. So we see hope in how the Aarhus Convention will embrace this social innovation in a sense. So I conclude here and I pass the word to Amelia for her follow-up.
So following up on a point you were just making, I think it's a point that we acknowledge in the article, but probably bears saying here to the group, that there are multiple statutes in the United States that allow citizens, environmental statutes, that allow citizens to essentially step into the role of a regulator. And if there is someone that's unlawfully polluting air or water, or dumping solid waste, or killing an endangered species, there are statutory provisions that allow that citizen to then send a notice saying, you have violated the law and I'm going to bring a lawsuit against you in federal court to enforce this violation and to ask the court to enjoin and stop the violation. And that is sort of the legal avenue or pathway that is the backdrop to this discussion in the case, and the legal apparatus that was in place to allow citizen collected evidence to sort of have a powerful role in challenging a problem that regulators were not addressing. And just to follow on that a little bit, this particular one was in the context of the Clean Water Act, which protects, water for citizens in the United States, or for everybody in the United States. Citizen, I should add just quickly, is a term of art that doesn't refer to citizenship. It's defined much more broadly than that. So when we say citizen enforcement, you don't actually need to be a citizen. That the statute was passed in the 70s when that term was not as charged as it is, or is not being used the same way, I guess, as it is now. And so we find ourselves having to dance around that quite a bit in the practice using these statutes now. In any event, so when I say citizen, I'm not referring to their citizenship, but if a person then, I'll just say person, decides to enforce for this violation or send a notice, the government can step in and say, no, we'll handle it. We will enforce for this violation. Thanks very much for letting us know. And that sometimes is sort of the end of the story. And that intervention by the government saying, we'll take care of this, can, as you might imagine, result in a very powerful outcome or a not very powerful outcome, because not always are governments motivated for a variety of reasons to do something very powerful to address a environmental problem, especially one that's been mounting for decades and has just been ignored. And that's where the coal ash cases arose in North Carolina. And so when that happens, there still is a way for citizens or for people that are impacted to participate in these proceedings. And so that is something explored just a little bit in this article, but it is very much in the context of the US legal system and how those environmental statutes are set up. And then another point I wanted to touch on was just to give a little bit of background to the groups that are working on these issues in the United States. And I guess addressing the question of technology and how it was gathered and how much organization was there, and I guess maybe even the level of sophistication, like how complicated do you make something like this? How simple do you make it? And then how do you intersect when it's complex science, the legal system? So the groups were a collection of nonprofits ranging from local, which I think is important from a legal advocate position in terms of legitimacy, especially in some places where I mean, for one, you will need standing as a legal matter, but two, to have a voice that's representing the community. So some of these are very local groups. River keepers are organizations that are dedicated to protecting specific water bodies. So for example, the French Broad River Keeper, or you could pick any river in the world and add River Keeper, and that organization's job is to protect or advocate for the conservation of that water body. And then some other smaller community nonprofits that work on environmental issues, around their towns and in their communities, but also ranging up to larger groups like the Sierra Club, which is a national group and who actually does some international work as well. So in that sense, this is pointed out because even though we picked the very local focus and the scale of North Carolina, this was an issue that ended up intersecting the federal legal landscape, and the groups that and the knowledge that was being put together was, and the groups that we were working with were those that had access and ways to engage at multiple levels of the legal system, from the very local all the way up to the national. And in terms of technology, I mean, the article, of course, explains, okay, and I will be done. Some of water quality sampling is along the more sophisticated lines. And then, of course, gathering information from public records can be simple, but if there are hundreds of thousands of public records, can be more complex. So maybe I can talk more about that in an answer to further questions. But what I would say is that it was not overly complex because it needed to allow engagement of those who are local residents and riverkeeper organizations. So not an overly complex technology platform setup. And I'll stop talking.
Thank you very much, Amelia and Anna, and thank you very much, Charles, for your insightful comments. So we'll open the floor for questions, remarks. If anybody wants to ask a question or some remarks on this fascinating paper.
So if there's no one else, I'll start. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper, and I think sort of the groundwork you did with really describing the efforts of citizens is in itself very interesting and very inspiring. So thank you for the paper. And I was sort of wondering how much this is a matter of particular political circumstances or a particular political culture where citizens are invited more by the government to sort of take on this role, and how much this is something that could be translated into other contexts. In your opinion, do you know of any other similar? I guess maybe Charles can even attest to that. But I thought this is a very empowering mode for local citizens in sort of taking over whatever is broken in their environment, even be it the sort of the physical environment or even the political environment, and trying together to extract the knowledge and get to crafting even policy to improve that. So how much of this is sort of translatable to other contexts, in your opinion?
Well, just a very quick answer in terms of what can be. So first of all, thank you for the question. And let's say, I think two answers can be given here. One, I may pass it to Amelia. So how much can it be replicated throughout the US? So if it's really a regional, like a south, for example, south of the US seems to be more neglected by the government, so maybe communities there. Also looking at other cases I've been following are more also self-organized to fill institutional gaps. To what extent can be replicable, for example, in Europe? I would say I come from European countries, so of course my view is EU biased, but I can say that in Europe, for example, we less have a culture of litigation, of class actions. So the idea of bringing this data to court for enforcement is something that we have way less. So then the rhetoric there is more to have this data or this evidence, also the process to influence media, to influence political processes, but not really as a ground for enforcement, which is a mind shift that I think through research like this, we can start making, because then other communities realize of this potential. So for example, right now, I see much potential in climate litigation, now booming also in Europe for using this kind of data. My other experience was as a lawyer in Chile and Ecuador. And there, for example, I can say, or for what I have heard from Taiwan, for example, that it's way more dangerous to organize this kind of structured counter system denounces. So I would say in these cases, there's also another layer of complexity, which is the risk that the government or the company may silence the people, and so it ends up being risky. So I would be very curious to hear from like colleagues from Israel how this case could be applied in the Israeli case. But of course, this could be a matter for further discussion. So I'll be very happy to hear from you on that. So Amelia, if you'd like to add something on the US context dependency.
Yeah, so thank you for your observation on the South, but indeed, I think the Clean Water Act Citizen Suit Authority can be and has been used in a similar manner throughout the United States. The other piece I wanted to add was that, that was sort of what I was focusing on initially, because that was the trigger in this instance to get the motions and the wheels going on this particular series of legal actions. But there was a whole part of these series of cases that was actually administrative advocacy. So, acquiring public records, having citizen sampling produced in comments through public processes that were open, that were not Clean Water Act related, but were just sort of public opportunities for the public to have input. So that was something sort of less like a citizen suit and just more like an opportunity for getting notice of actions and commenting on those actions, and getting crowdsourcing essentially knowledge in order to inform those processes and ensure transparency in that decision making. And I think that is something that is potentially translatable even where something like a citizen suit authority doesn't exist.
Thank you. So we still have Alon, Shelly, and Iddo who all want to make comments or ask questions. So I suggest we take all three of them, and then we'll give both of you a chance to react. So Alon.
Hi. So first of all, it's nice to have a session that's centered on optimism, when we'll move from optimism to pessimism back and forth throughout the next few days, and so it's a nice start. And I have two small questions. The first regards the Aarhus Convention, and how do you think it can be utilized to promote the production of such technologies and of methods of empowering citizens to use all kind of sensing. And the second, I think that it would be interesting to juxtapose it with Sharon's papers that will be presented on Thursday, and to think of whether what you see in those instances is a form of regulation that promotes a statist kind of interest, a public interest that is connected to the state, or is it something a bit different? And in regards also, I think, to the distinction that Amelia made regarding the question of citizenship, right? Of whether it's citizens, when in some instances what we see is also what we might see is also places where that kind of citizens sensing is used against the state also. So it's not just regulation, but it's something might be a bit else. Thank you.
Shelly?
Hi, so first, thank you for this really great paper and a very impressive project. And I have two analytical questions. So one would be, I want to ask about the connection between crowds and social movements or communal action. So in what way do you think that the notion of crowd or the literature on crowd and crowdsourcing can help us understand better social movements and the way they work, if at all? And then the second question has to do with experts. So you discussed the connections between people sensing, neighbors living nearby and using their tools to sense, and then the reliance on experts. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about mobilizing experts within crowds, or whether or not experts are part of crowds. That's something that also comes up in Galit's paper that will be discussed tomorrow. So thank you.
Okay, and I will take Iddo, and then you can respond to all the questions.
So I'd like to thank you also, and moving from optimism to pessimism, want to raise the question whether this process can be manipulated or hijacked for kind of bad purposes, because it's not so regulated or supervised. So we kind of rely, if I understand correctly, on the people to sense these data correctly, whether, in some instances they can manipulate the data more easily than others, or when two groups, compete with each other, and then one group has an interest to compete with the other, or one state against the other. And also whether courts do any trouble, maybe it's in the paper and didn't find it, in the sense of saying this evidence is not reliable enough because it's based on people's observation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes. So Anna and Amelia, go ahead.
Okay, so we agreed that I'll go first and then I'll pass the word to Amelia. So I'll make sure to stay in 2 minutes. So then I have the bulk for Amelia. So very quickly, I think the idea that this is an isolated case or a widespread trend, I would say it's quite not a single case, in the sense that so far I've been mapping many cases where from governmental failure, a sort of creative social response come up to the fore. So I would say this is definitely not an isolated case, but we don't have time here to go through all of that. With the question on state interest, also sensing against state interest, definitely. For example, in south of Italy, in Basilicata, a case where I'm following, monitoring the contamination into milk and other type of products, like in the products from the land, is really damaging the sort of economic interest of the state and also of locals, which is also why the local sentinels are particularly, let's say, not well seen by other fellow people, because they are kind of undermining the prestige of products coming from oil-rich land, which also means contamination-rich land. Then on the understanding of social movements, I think many social movements now are also embracing science. And this is also why I see more and more connection between movements such as the Extinction Rebellion and civic monitoring, because social movements are becoming scientific and expert crowds can be mobilized, definitely. And I see much potential in climate science, attribution science, even more than traditional, let's say, environmental sciences. And lastly, on the manipulation, sure, this is one of the main concerns that we have, and I have been following cases where they were sort of gatekeepers. So kind of the wise of the crowd that were also checking, that were not, let's say, also personal interest, or if they were, to kind of monitor this kind of possible risk. And in a sense, sometimes you can just not prevent such risk. But the point is that even if the data are manipulated, the perception, the fact, the understanding of the process to understand why these people manipulate this data, I think is an important data for governors. So let's say the court definitely checked this. And this is also why, for example, in another case, in the Formosa case, the fact that there were just pictures and plastic samples ensured that it couldn't be manipulated because there were factual evidence. The more you make the analysis, the more there is the risk of manipulation. So of course, the more the court will check whether the procedure has been robust enough. In any case, I think the layers of professionalization that this kind of civic monitoring is presenting could ensure some sort of gatekeeping. But at the same time, I fully endorse your point that there is a risk of manipulation, but in a sense, it's also another noise that can enter the discourse. And then a wise court or wise policymakers would probably realize that, I'm pretty sure. So I'm passing the word to Amelia.
We have 2 minutes, so just...
Okay, I will address briefly the question of experts, how and whether to involve experts and what kind, from inside the crowd, from someone external, and also this question of reliability. And I think they're a little bit related, actually. Yes, I think often this type of data or citizen evidence is essentially existing in combination with other tools, right? And that's where experts often can come in and review data. Very often, I think these types of people with special expertise in these areas are often in the crowd, but it often also makes sense to consult with someone who's not in the crowd. It's sort of an approach to ensure they're another set of eyes. I think just from a legal perspective, these are simply problems you try to anticipate in advance if you're going to use this kind of information. And in order to sort of vet the information and make sure it's reliable and on its strongest footing for anywhere that you think it should be deployed, essentially. I think that helps reduce some of the reliability concerns. But I also think that it's important, as Anna is saying, that all of it, in a sense, is important information. Whether it is reliable or whether someone has become adventurous in some way and wanted to do something to the data, which is honestly not something I've encountered a whole lot of, because just on a personal note, people are often very invested and want to make sure they do things correctly and want to make sure their voice is heard, and want to do everything they can, and are just looking for ways to make sure this information is able to be relayed and used and is helpful and is complete. And that's one of the really interesting and positive things about working in this space, just to end on a positive note.
Okay, so thank you very much for a very interesting panel and 2 papers. So I think we're going on a coffee break, right, until 19:15 Tel Aviv time. So that's in 28 minutes. So see you all in 28 minutes, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all.